Welcome, Escalon Presbyterian Church, and we're happy to have you here for another conversation via Zoom. And today I've got with me Dr. Jerry Sittser, a good man from the University of Whitworth. Welcome, Jerry, to our call.
My pleasure, Troy. Thank you for inviting me.
So, got to know Jerry over the years, one who actually I got to know first through his writings and then got to know personally through friendship he has with Jim. And so I'm kind of part of the Jerry fan club here. We got your books going here, Jerry. Water from a Deep Well. A Grace Disguised, which is one you're known for, how a soul grows through loss. And a follow-up one, great one, The Grace Revealed. But the book we want to talk about today is one that's got really an intriguing title and subcaption called Resilient Faith: How the Early Christian Church Changed the World. It's just been published. It's out by Brazos Press. So, Jerry, tell us a little about how this book came to be and its importance for you.
Well, I make my living teaching church history, which makes me kind of a nerd, but I do love the subject a lot, and I think it's profoundly relevant. When I went to seminary in the 70s, looking back now, I realized I received what I call a more Christendom education. The focus was on doctrinal disputes. In one sense, my church history classes were a history of Christian doctrine, kind of who was right and who was wrong. Initially, it was Orthodox as opposed to various heresies, but then you move into the Middle Ages, especially the Reformation, and it's Calvinists were right and the Catholics were wrong, and so on and so forth. And then there was some attention paid to renewal movements too. So many years later, I'm studying for classes that I teach at Whitworth, and I bumped into a phrase that I couldn't remember reading before, even though I know I read the document when I was much younger. And I couldn't remember any attention drawn to it by the faculty member, and that was this notion of third race or third way. The document comes from the middle of the 2nd century. We don't know the author's name. We do know the recipient of the letter. He was a Roman official. And the phrase third race, or I use third way, was familiar to the pagan official who was receiving the letter. And it underscored the uniqueness of the Christian movement. The Christian movement in the ancient world was so different from other movements of the time that they didn't know what to call it. And so Roman officials began to call it this kind of third alternative or third way or third race. And race is really interesting, actually. So the first was the Roman way, pagan religion. The second was the Jewish way. Jews were powerful and influential in the ancient world. And then there was the third way, or the third race, the Christian. When he wrote this document, I mean, there were maybe at most 100,000 Christians in an empire of 50 to 60 million people. So you have to ask the question, why pay attention to this movement in the first place? But Roman officials kind of intuitively knew something was going on, and this was radically new. So that piqued my curiosity a great deal. Well, then I began to run into other phrases, and I wondered why it was that I never learned about these things when I was in seminary. Good case in point, the last full chapter of the book I dedicate to the catechumenate, which was a training vehicle that the early Christian movement used to prepare people for church membership. It took 2 to 3 years to complete before someone submitted a baptism, received the Holy Spirit, and took their first Eucharist or first communion. And this was empire-wide, this vehicle, this tool that was used. And I thought to myself, if this was standard practice in early Christianity, why had I never heard of it before? So anyway, that led me on a trail, and I began to study. And now, and it led to what you have before you, Resilient Faith: How the Early Christian, quote, third way changed the world.
Well, I think this is fascinating. I've been having some conversations with folk recently on the importance of history, and I've interviewed for these conversations a New Testament scholar and a theologian, and it seems like the church historian is kind of the third wheel on a date. They don't get as much attention, and yet
no.
Make a case, Jerry, for the study of Christian history in order to help us grow in our faith.
Well, I mean, I think about all the advertisements we're seeing on TV right now on ancestry. Everyone wants to know what their roots are. We all came from somewhere, Troy. That's why our nose is a particular shape, or why we have certain habits that can be traced back a generation, often much farther. We are never born in a vacuum. We are not self-made people. We carry with us a past. And that can be a past that's familiar. It can also be a past that's national and in some cases global. So it really helps us to understand where we've come from, the mistakes that were made in the past, as well as the successes, so that we can learn to understand our own time and place and respond creatively, critically, and to it. A famous or a writer from many years ago called it a usable past. We need to, but in fact, that leads to another comment I want to make. Many people teaching history do it poorly, and it becomes nothing but names and dates. And it's kind of like an anecdote. It makes people not want to study history if it's taught poorly. And so I really try to show that we're dealing here with people who were once alive, that they sang, they prayed, they worshiped, they fought, they loved, they launched creative ventures. They did the same kinds of stuff then that we do today. And that makes it a lot more relevant. In my classes, we sing every day. We say the prayers of the church every day. We use liturgies from the history of the church every day. I try to use a lot of bells and whistles, in other words, to draw them into the living history of the church rather than a history of just a bunch of dead people.
I like that.
And I hope this book underscores the relevance of especially early Christianity and how it might speak to the church today. They were living in a post-Christendom environment. They had to figure out how to do Christianity and do church and do discipleship in an environment that was inhospitable to Christianity and very different from Christianity. Pagan religion had virtually nothing in common with the Christian movement. And we're entering what I call, or that was a pre-Christendom environment. We're entering what I would now call a post-Christendom environment. Surely on the coasts, we're experiencing more and more of this. And I think it will creep into the Midwest as well. We're seeing in Europe that this is very widespread. And so I think we can learn from a group of people who are trying to figure out how to be Christian in a pre-Christendom environment as we slip into a post-Christendom environment where Christianity is no longer the religious assumption of the culture.
Yeah, there seems to be a lot of similarities between our own cultural matrix right now and what the early church in the letters we have in the New Testament we're dealing with. It's almost like a version of deja vu. Very much front and center. So let's go to the book a little bit here. And kind of unpack maybe 3 things today. I'm looking at some of the chapters, encouraging people to read that. Describe the third way community in comparison to the other 2 ways. What was distinctive about the people and the community in which they lived?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a very relevant topic in our own time and place. The Roman world assigned identities to people. It was a highly stratified culture, so you could be rich. About 5% or less of the people would be considered rich. In our day, that wouldn't be a Bill Gates rich, that would just be well-to-do. About 95% of the people were considered poor. Most were working poor, but there was actually a fairly large group of people who were not working at all. It was very much, the society was very much based on a patronage system. So Rome hated poor people. If people could not pay back, either work for you or vote for you or something, they would literally push them off to the side of the road. They had no sense of a calling of charity that we would understand today. patronage system. There were identities based on whether you were a slave or whether you were free. I mean, all of this came into play in the ancient world, and Christianity stepped into that environment and really assigned people a brand new identity. And it was profoundly impactful on the ancient world. As a Christian, your primary identity was to be a follower of Jesus. You were a Christian. Not so much a Roman or barbarian, not male or female, not slave or free. We use those words in the New Testament, but that actually carried over for the first few hundred years. And those primary identities shaped all the secondary identities people were assigned by virtue of living in the social order. So Christianity did not abolish the identity of being, say, a father or a mother or a servant, a household servant, or a master of an estate. It didn't abolish it, but it began to change those identities, kind of like salt, leaven, and light, so that though you were still a father, being a follower of Jesus meant you became a different kind of follower, a different kind of servant, a different kind of master, a different kind of woman, so on and so forth. So that identity, primary identity of being a follower of Jesus, began to gradually shape and change all of those secondary identities. Well, that also spilled over into community life. Your primary identity was to be a Christian, and your life was knit together with other Christians. There was this deep sense of what they called the new oikumene, a fancy word that meant the Commonwealth. Rome considered itself the Commonwealth of the world, the empire. It had no rivals. It dominated a gigantic amount of land, wrapping all the way around the Mediterranean world, spilling in the east, north, and south. I mean, it was a huge empire. And they called themselves the new and dominant Commonwealth. And then this little fledgling movement shows up and says, well, no, actually, we're the new Commonwealth. And they had a deep sense of belonging to a global movement. So you could speak Latin, you could speak Greek, Coptic, Syriac, eventually Goth. As Christianity grew, it began to penetrate more language groups. But you were all part of the same family. You belonged to the same group of people. And that too was pretty threatening to the Roman world. For this fledgling movement, with people who were pacifists, saying that they were the new Commonwealth and that the identity of being a Christian in community was far more fundamental than being a Roman or a member of any other kind of class or race or group of people, was menacing, threatening, and curious to Rome. Now, in my mind, that is profoundly relevant to our own time and place. A lot of social science research is being done right now, Troy, and it's actually happening that people are identifying, or I should say Christians are identifying more strongly with a political party than they are with the church. So we're getting more and more red churches or blue churches, like we're getting red states or blue states. That's terrible. That's a terrible witness. My primary identity is being a Christian. I belong to other Christians. That means I belong to Christians who are of the opposite political persuasion as I am, or live in other parts of the world and speak different languages and sing different hymns. My identity is formed by Jesus Christ. And that will, again, like it did in the ancient world, begin to function as salt, leaven, and light in the way I function as a Republican or as a Democrat or a citizen living in Michigan or California or Georgia, or being an American. I'm not an American Christian. I'm a Christian who happens to live in America. And my primary identity, my sense of community, is more fundamental being with other Christians around the world than it is even with the next door neighbor who isn't a follower of Jesus. So that exercised a huge impact in the ancient world.
Do you see in that community aspect a real tight-knit group of people? I mean, in your research, do you see the ways in which they went to bat for each other, supported one
Oh,
another.
oh, sure. I mean, never perfectly. There's no golden age of Christianity, Troy. Not even the apostolic period was a golden age. All you have to do is look at the church in Corinth, and makes every church in America today look healthy in comparison. So I want to make sure that we don't commit the error of looking at a particular period of history, whether it's early Christianity or 1950s and 60s America, and think that it's kind of the golden age. It wasn't. Having said that, they did do things differently. So our religion in America tends to be very consumer driven. So we go to church and we evaluate the sermon or we evaluate programs, and then we determine whether that church is worthy of our attendance. In the early Christian period, church worship, community functioned very differently. It was more fundamental to their own sense of identity, and it was broken down into smaller units. Archaeologists have not discovered an actual, what we might call, church building, so to speak. It was actually a large hall. It wasn't even a church as we would understand it today, not until 240 AD. That's 200 years after the church Christian movement got started. And we don't have real church buildings as we would understand it today until the 4th century, some 300 years after the birth of Christianity, or just shy of that. So Christians had to learn how to function without a building as we would understand it today. Most of it was done by meeting in homes, or in some cases, they would rent small halls. I estimate, and again, this is all speculative, but when I crunch the numbers, if I would estimate that the average church size before Constantine came to power and we actually had church buildings, I estimate that the average church size was somewhere between 50 and 75 people. By the year 300, there were probably about 65,000 house churches or churches in the Mediterranean world, an equal number east of Syria, but I don't want to jump into that topic. And when you go to a church of 50 to 75 people, you know who's there and who's not. Mm-hmm. So that was one big difference, is it was just broken down into much smaller units. The other one is they met together more frequently. And the reason why is because their identity or their sense of community was much stronger than we would identify today. It was kind of a primary unit of fellowship. But the other thing is that churches were so close by. The Christian movement was born largely in urban centers in the early years of Christianity. You know, Paul went to Corinth and Philippi and eventually ended up in Rome. Those were large urban centers. Corinth had probably 100,000 people, Antioch 250,000 people, Ephesus between 2 and 250,000 people. Rome was a city of a million, with a density that was greater than Manhattan Island. And no building was higher than 6 to 8 stories. So people just lived on top of each other. And so you could walk literally 100 yards to a church and there'd be 50 believers gathered there. So one ancient document says that most Christians gathered every day for a short worship service early in the morning. Well, what does that do? That creates a strong sense of community. Nowadays, it's amazing if a small group meets once a week. We consider those people highly religious and pious, and they met once a day.
Well, let's talk about the worship experience. Obviously, in the world in which there were 2 other ways, it wasn't as if there was a worship vacuum. Emperor worship was going on constantly, and of course, the Jewish world was very integrally involved in their own practice of worship. What was the third way's distinctive piece of what it means to worship God?
Well, the ancient world's method of worship was largely transactional. Mm-hmm. So people didn't go to a worship service in the ancient world as we would understand it today. There were feasts and festivals that communities participated in. The people organizing those were not clergy. They were political leaders that also functioned as priests for a community and would often endow or become patrons of a pagan temple. So people would participate in these larger pagan feasts and festivals, but that was more like Memorial Day would be for us, or July 4, or something like that, not religious as we would understand the term today. Otherwise, people would visit temples and shrines and monuments often, offering sacrifices, going to places where they think it would increase their own fortunes or the fortunes of the empire. They would appease gods, they would please gods and goddesses and hope that there would be some kind of payback. So all scholars call ancient Roman religion largely transactional, not relational. Worship was done to gain earthly benefits. Now, the Jews obviously lived very differently. They had their synagogues and they would gather for teaching, instruction, and so on Saturdays, and they chant the Psalms and other things. But the difference in the case of Jews is that they were much more isolated from the culture. The wall over which you had to climb to become a Jew was very high. I mean, it wasn't just conversion to Judaism. You had to submit to circumcision, follow food laws, dress codes, and lots of other things that was very culturally demanding. And so the Jews were not a conversion-oriented religion, and they tended to live in very isolated communities. So though their ethics were attractive in the ancient world, at least to some people, very few actually became Jews. And then you take Christianity, which was a conversion-oriented faith. Worship functioned to kind of consolidate the community together. When they gathered, they would gather to hear the word of God. They would listen to it, by the way, because there were very few Bibles. All Bibles had to be hand copied. And so they would gather to listen to the word of God. And because they read so much of it and read long sections, much of this was put to memory. Memory was far more important in early Christianity than we would ever imagine today, because we have the printed word and now we've got it on our cell phones. There's some sadness there to me, because knowing you can access the word of God is not the same thing as actually knowing the word of God. I mean, how many telephone numbers do people remember anymore? I mean, I can still remember my childhood telephone number, but we don't remember them anymore because we can just say the name of the person on our phone and the phone will immediately ring them up. So they didn't have access to as much information, but the information they had, namely the Bible, they tended to learn much better than we do today, because they were a highly oral culture. They would pray. They would listen to the word of God. They would take the sacrament every week. They would give of their tithes and offerings. And often this was in real goods, food and other things. And then the deacons would immediately distribute them to the people who were in need. I call early Christian worship highly formational worship, as opposed to consumer-oriented worship. When you went to worship with the people of God, you were actually being formed in the faith. You were being trained. I used the analogy of I just forgot the word, improvisation. Okay, so to be a good improvisational artist, whether musician or person in theater, you have to attain mastery. I once heard a classical musician do an improvisational concert about 10 years ago. And somebody from the audience hummed a tune to her. It happened to be the Imperial Death March from Star Wars. She had never heard it before, by the way, too busy concertizing. And she listened and smiled. And then she played an 8-minute piece of classical music. And she composed the entire thing on the spot. Now, you can't do that if you've not mastered the classical repertoire and musical theory and that kind of thing. You see the same thing happen in athletics. Soccer and basketball are two improvisational sports. The reason why it's not chaos on the court, in spite of the constant shifting of offense and defense and so on, and the fluid nature of the game, is because those athletes have achieved mastery. Well, in the early Christian movement, worship was that occasion in which people were prepared to be followers of Jesus when they actually left the house church and returned to their rather inhospitable or curious communities. So it was formational, not consumer oriented.
Do you have that concern for our church today, a lack of formational understanding of worship?
Oh, I do a lot. And I think it's going to be more and more costly all the time. When you live in a Christendom environment, the whole culture kind of assumes that you're somehow, at least to some degree, Christian. There may be a lot of nominalism, but that's kind of what we call the default mode of the culture. And when you have that habit and then begin to move into a post-Christendom environment, you get exposed for not really knowing the faith as well as you should to survive, and not being able to practice it very well either. It's not very helpful if you only have the Bible on your phone when you really need to know the Bible in circumstances that pose challenges to you. So I think we're in this weird transitional phase of assuming we're still in Christendom, but moving toward post-Christendom, and we're really not prepared for it. It's kind of like a pandemic. You know, we think we're a wealthy nation, we've got great medical care, I mean, we're going to be just fine. And we don't realize that we're highly unprepared for a pandemic. Experts have been screaming this for years now. There was an article in The Atlantic 2 years ago that said a pandemic is going to come and we are going to be caught flat-footed. Well, everybody said, oh, come on, this is the United States. Well, that's a kind of nice analogy where you get caught by surprise and you thought you were more prepared than you are. So we're living with a Christendom mentality in an increasingly post-Christendom world. And I think we're being caught by surprise. It certainly happens when we send our kids off to college and university, doesn't it?
Yeah.
They're just knocked over. Oh my goodness, they're not prepared for the kind of environment they're stepping into. And many lose their faith. Right now, about 30% of 20-somethings define themselves as non-religious. Highest number in many, many decades in American history.
Fast. Yeah, that is definitely a concern, and a concern for us as well as we continue to begin engaging in more deeper discipleship formation. That's kind of on the radar of our church right now. And so
and I'm wondering if this pandemic is forcing that even more, as we can't gather for worship. That consumer mentality is being exposed. I mean, what do you have? You can't go to church anymore, quote unquote. We don't go to church, we go to worship. We are the church. But with that loss, some are going to drift away, but others are going to realize, I've got to drive my root system deeper here. Mm-hmm. I've got to really know Christians. I need to move to a new level of discipleship, because I cannot sustain faith if the church service, as we've traditionally defined it, has been stripped from us.
Well, that's a good segue into this last piece, Jerry, the life in the world. What was distinctive about the Third Way in which they interacted with the culture and lived out their faith? Because if that's the kind of thing we're looking towards, there obviously has to be a greater attention to the preparation for people to be sent out into the world to be the light.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a curious thing to observe. First, you need to realize right away the Christians never protested to Rome. They never marched on Rome. They never really demanded their rights. The only right they demanded is to be treated fairly in a court of law. And the reason in that case was because Christians were being arrested merely for being Christian. And when they'd go before a court of law, the judge would ask them, or the official would ask them 3 times, Troy, are you a Christian? And if they said all 3 times yes, then they'd be executed. And certain Christian writers said, oh, no, wait a minute. I mean, What is that? I mean, what's the charge of being Christian? Give us something substantial. Have we actually committed a crime? And the answer, of course, was no. Famous writer Tertullian, who died around 220, said, "We are being accused of the crime of a name rather than the name of a crime." Very clever phrasing
Yeah.
there. But outside that, you don't see a lot of political visibility on the part of Christians. What you do see is huge impact on the culture based on their lifestyle and their service. And there's a lot of evidence there that we have. For example, the church in Rome in the year 250 had 1,500 people of need on its payroll. They took care of orphans. They took care of widows. They visited prisoners. They acted heroically, caring for people during two big pandemics that swept through the Roman world, one in the year 165 and the other in the year 250. They did a lot of medical care, of course, not in the sophisticated way that we would understand today, but they still did provide medical care. So much so that the first hospital, as we would understand the term even today, was founded by a Christian bishop around the year 360. And it became such a gigantic enterprise, it actually became its own separate city, and it took on the honorific name of the person who founded it, Basil of Caesarea. It was called Basilides. So, or the Basileads. So, the Christians were on the forefront of serving the society, caring for it. They also upheld high moral standards. They absolutely resisted infant exposure, for example. They resisted abortion. They required men to live by the same set of moral standards as women when it applied to marriage. In the ancient world, men could dally around. You know, they could flirt, they could have concubines or have affairs and that sort of thing. And Christian movement said, no, you have to behave as you expect your wife to behave. One woman, that's it. So in many ways, they cared for their children. They included them in the life of the church on so many levels, both in terms of service to society and in terms of the moral standards they followed. They were very much set apart. But they didn't appear to be fundies either, as we would understand the term in our culture today. They were warm, they were welcoming, they were generous. So though they set high standards among themselves, they were very successful in reaching the pagan population.
It's gracious.
Think about it. They grew from about 5,000 in, say, the year 50 to 5 million in the year 300, before just on the eve of the last and worst persecution in early Christianity. 5,000 to 5 million.
So they were winsome in their faith and not.
They were winsome. That's the word that I love. They were winsome. You know, think about it. You let's say I'm working in a marketplace and I have my wife with me and 3 daughters. Okay, let's just use that as an example. Well, first of all, they're amazed that I have 3 daughters. They're even more amazed that instead of being grumpy, I'm cheerful. I'm nice to my daughters. I'm gracious to my wife. And they know that I have a reputation for being faithful to her. They notice that I'm not attending any pagan temples. I'm not offering sacrifices. I don't have household gods and goddesses. I never visit shrines and so on. So they're curious. And because they come to my little stall every day, I get to know some of these neighbors and these customers. And they begin to ask me questions. And pretty soon I have them over for a meal. There you go. And they become catechumens. And then they go through a 2 to 3 year training program. Very counterintuitive to us, isn't it? 2 to 3 years of training. And then they take final vows and become members of the church. We tend to dumb down. They maintain those high standards. By the way, I'm almost done creating a 2-year catechumenate that we're going to offer through Whitworth.
Oh, I look forward to seeing
We're
that.
calling it a new catechumenate.
I'm looking forward to seeing that.
We have 3 pilot churches that are going through the first year right now. One is First Pres in Missoula. Dan Creevy, you might even know him.
Good friend.
And they have 125 people in it out of about 140 at the church.
I love it. Well, let's close with kind of a conversation about today. And this is a topic you've thought a lot about, Jerry, because I've watched some conversations you've had online, because you are both an author to a larger community, but you interface with students in an entirely new reality with respect to the fact that in your classrooms, there's Wi-Fi and there's cell phones and there's computers. And we are, because of the coronavirus, required to have conversations like this. And this is really a blessing to be able to do it. I really enjoy this more than a phone call, even just to be able to see your face and your eyes and your expressions, right? And it feels more relational, but it's still not ideal. What would you say are the advantages of our technological improvements, and what are the things that would be detrimental to this formation of Christ in the life of a Christian?
Well, a lot of research is being done on the impact of cell phones, smartphones on people. Teenagers, the more time they spend on a smartphone, the more depressed they become. I mean, that's just a fact. They've done so much research on this. It tends to lead to greater isolation and loneliness and alienation. In being connected to everyone, we end up being connected to no one. And it tends to dominate our brains, so that even if I'm in a conversation with you and I hear my phone buzz, part of my brain goes to the buzz right away, which means less of my brain is being devoted to you right now. See? So we have become highly, highly dependent on these phones and on other forms of connection and on social media. And for the most part, it seems to be doing more harm than it's doing good, undermining sense of community and relationship and lots of other things. So I think we need to be very vigilant that we use it as a tool and it does not become our master. I teach a Jan term course. I just taught my last one this past January. I take students to the mountains for a month, and I create a monastic community. And we serve each other. We do kitchen duty. We study a lot. We do projects on the camp. We follow a Benedictine rule. And I introduce them to what I call monastic culture and monastic practice. But one thing they have to do is fast from all media for a month. So there's no cell phones of any kind. There's no TV. There's no movies. There's no radio. Phone, nothing. Zero. They go cold turkey. The only way they hear from people is through snail mail. And at first, this is really hard for them, Troy. And then they become liberated, and it's observable. So you'll start to see conversations around the table going longer. By the second week, I have to literally yell at them to get up from the table and get on with chores, because they would stay there for 2 hours lost in conversation. Some tables laughing, others leaning into each other, talking about something really serious. So they rediscover friendship, and they rediscover attentiveness, not only in conversation with each other, but also in their relationship with God. They begin to memorize scripture. And when they return to normal life, they return wanting, not always doing this successfully, but wanting to learn to be the master of their technology. So I encourage them, put your phone to bed at night. Tuck it into bed, not your own. In other words, put it away, turn it off. Don't get it out of bed until you've gotten up and had a quiet time of some kind and had breakfast and got your life centered for the day before God, before you begin to flip through the phone, checking on weather, emails, texts, and everything else. So it doesn't become a form of distraction. I hope that this pandemic is going to increase our appreciation for embodied relationships. We're embodied creatures. God made us that way. When God chose to communicate with us, his ultimate expression of communication was becoming a human being. I mean, imagine even in his resurrected body, Jesus asked for a piece of fish to eat. That's not on screen, is it, Troy? That's the
No.
real thing.
My folks are very much looking forward to um, meeting together in the church, and
Yeah.
at what point it'll be allowed just a simple hug.
Oh,
Um,
we're starved for it. Let this be a warning, and I hope we don't forget this.
well said.
Yeah.
Well, Jerry, I really appreciate your time from looks like a beautiful day in Spokane, Washington.
Yeah.
And
Thank you. Thank you,
we,
Troy.
may God bless this
Appreciate
book.
you and the good work you're doing.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. The Lord bless and keep you. Thanks for including me.
You bet.